2 badges, 1 pole, and a mistake that would cost them everything. Officer Brett Kowalski laughed as he tightened the zip tie around the stranger's wrists, mocking the man's cheap suit and dusty shoes. "You think you can just walk into Oak Haven and stare at us, boy?" Brett sneered, while his partner filmed the humiliation for their private group chat. The stranger didn't scream. He didn't beg. He just stared at them with eyes that held the weight of 1,000 storms. What Brett didn't know was that the man tied to that pole wasn't a drifter. He was David Sterling, the most decorated tactical commander in the state, and as of 8:00 a.m. that morning, their new chief of police. And the camera they were laughing at, it was recording the evidence for their own funeral. The heat in Oak Haven was the kind that stuck to your skin like wet wool. It was a drowsy Tuesday in late July, the air shimmering off the asphalt of Main Street. David Sterling walked slowly, his gait uneven, favoring his left leg slightly, a souvenir from a raid in Chicago 3 years prior. He wore a plain grey t-shirt that had seen better days, faded denim jeans, and a pair of work boots that were covered in the red dust of the roadside. To anyone passing by, David looked like a drifter, perhaps a mechanic down on his luck, or a wandering labourer looking for a day's wage. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, pausing to look up at the brick facade of the Oak Haven Police Department. He wasn't due to officially start his tenure as the new chief of police until the following morning, but David was a man of precision. He wanted to see his precinct before they knew he was there. He wanted to see how his officers behaved when the boss wasn't watching. He didn't have to wait long to find out. A squad car, sleek and black with "To Protect and Serve" emblazoned in ironic gold letters on the side, curbed slowly next to him. The window rolled down with an electric hum. Officer Brett Kowalski sat in the driver's seat. He was a thick-necked man with a buzz cut that did little to hide the aggressive set of his jaw. In the passenger seat was Officer Chad Higgins, younger, softer, with a nervous energy that usually translated into trying too hard to impress his senior partner. "Lost, pal?" Brett asked. It wasn't a question, it was a challenge. David turned slowly. He kept his hands visible, resting them near his waist. He had been a cop for 20 years. He knew the dance. "Just passing through," David said, his voice a deep, calm baritone. "Checking out the town." "Checking out the town," Brett repeated, turning to Chad with a smirk. "Hear that, Chad? He's a tourist with no car, walking on the side of the highway in 90-degree heat." Chad chuckled, though it sounded forced. "Looks suspicious to me, Brett." Brett opened the door and stepped out. He was a big man, over 6 feet, and he used his size like a weapon. He rested his hand on his utility belt, right above his taser. "Let's see some ID." David didn't flinch. "It's in my back pocket. I'm going to reach for it slowly." "Don't tell me what you're going to do," Brett snapped, stepping into David's personal space. The smell of stale coffee and chewing tobacco wafted off the officer. "You look like you match the description of a suspect we had reported earlier. Peeping Tom. Loitering." David knew there was no report. He had been listening to the scanner on an earpiece hidden in his pocket until 5 minutes ago. The channel had been dead silent. "I just got into town," David said calmly. "My truck overheated 2 miles back. I'm just looking for a mechanic and a glass of water." "Truck overheated," Brett mocked. He circled David, his eyes scanning the man's worn clothes. He saw poverty. He saw weakness. And in Oak Haven, under Brett Kowalski's watch, poverty was a crime. "You know, we don't like vagrants here. Keeps the property values down." "I'm not a vagrant," David said, his eyes locking onto Brett's nameplate. "B. Kowalski." He filed that away. "I have business at the station," Brett laughed out loud. Business at the station? What, you turning yourself in? Something like that, David said cryptically. Turn around, Brett barked, his mood shifting from mocking to aggressive in a heartbeat. Hands on the hood. Now. Is there a reason for this detainment, officer? David asked. He didn't move. He stood his ground, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly into a defensive stance. Brett's face turned a shade of crimson. He wasn't used to back talk, certainly not from someone who looked like David. The reason is I said so. Failure to comply. Resisting an officer. I can invent 5 reasons before you hit the pavement. Now move! Brett lunged forward, grabbing David's shoulder to spin him around. It was a sloppy move, one that David could have countered in a split second. He could have dropped Brett to his knees and disarmed him before Chad even got out of the car. But David did nothing. He let the officer spin him. He let Brett slam his chest onto the hot metal of the squad car hood. This was a test, and Brett Kowalski was failing it spectacularly. Watch the head, Chad yelled, finally stepping out of the car, looking around to see if anyone was watching. Shut up, Chad, Brett grunted, jamming his knee into the back of David's thigh. Search him. Chad patted David down with trembling hands. He pulled out a wallet. ID says, David Sterling, from Chicago. Chicago. Brett spat on the ground near David's boot. Big city rat, probably running from a warrant. Check the rest of the wallet, David said, his voice muffled against the hood. There's a badge in there. Brett snatched the wallet from Chad. He flipped it open. He saw the Illinois driver's license. He saw a few credit cards. He saw a folded piece of paper. But he didn't see a badge. David realized with a sinking feeling he had left his old retired badge in his suitcase at the hotel. He only had his appointment letter. The folded paper. Brett pulled out the paper, glanced at it without reading, and crumbled it up, tossing it into the dirt. Garbage! No badge here, liar. Read the letter, David said, his patience thinning. I'm done reading, Brett said. He pulled a pair of zip ties from his belt instead of handcuffs. It was a technique used to demean, to treat a suspect like cattle rather than a citizen. You're coming with us, but not to the station just yet. We need to teach you a lesson about respect. They didn't put him in the car. Instead, Brett grabbed David by the back of his collar and marched him toward the town square, just a block away. It was a humiliating procession. Chad drove the cruiser slowly alongside them, looking anxious, while Brett paraded his catch down the sidewalk. The town square of Oak Haven was centered around a large historic clock tower and several wooden utility poles that held banners for the upcoming summer fair. You want to stand around our town? Brett hissed into David's ear. You want to loiter? Fine, I'll help you loiter. They reached a utility pole right in front of Patty's diner. The lunch rush was just starting. People were inside eating burgers and fries, looking out the window. A few pedestrians stopped, whispering. Officer, what's going on? An elderly woman asked, clutching her purse. Police business, ma'am, Brett shouted, puffing his chest out. Caught this guy prowling around the elementary school, just securing the scene until transport arrives. It was a lie so vile it made David's blood boil. Prowling a school. That was the kind of accusation that got people killed by angry mobs. I never went near a school, David said, his voice loud enough for the bystanders to hear. Officer Kowalski is lying. I was walking on the highway. Shut your mouth! Brett shoved David against the wooden pole. Splinters dug into David's cheek. Brett took the long, heavy-duty zip ties. He forced David's arms around the pole, pulling them backward at an agonizing angle. He cinched the plastic ties tight, too tight. They bit into David's wrists, cutting off circulation instantly. There, Brett grinned. stepping back to admire his handiwork. He looked like a hunter posing with a deer. "Now you can watch the town all you want. Chad, get a picture. Put it on the group chat. Caption it. Caught a stray dog today." Chad hesitated. He held up his phone. "Brett, I don't know. Maybe we should just book him." "Take the picture!" Brett roared. Chad snapped the photo. The flash didn't go off in the sunlight, but the shutter sound was audible. David stood tied to the pole. The humiliation was total. He was a grown man, a decorated commander, trussed up like an animal in the center of a town he was supposed to protect. The sun beat down on his head. Sweat stung his eyes. Inside the diner, a man stood up. His name was Mr. Henderson, the local high school football coach. He was a big man, respected in town. He walked out of the diner, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "Brett," Henderson said, his voice stern. "What the hell is this? You can't just tie a man to a pole in the middle of the day. This isn't the Wild West." "Back off, coach," Brett warned, his hand drifting to his taser again. "This guy is dangerous. We're waiting for the wagon." "The station is 2 blocks away," Henderson argued. "Walk him there or put him in the car. This is torture. Look at his hands, they're turning purple." David looked at Henderson. There are still good people here, he thought. "Good." "I appreciate it," David said to the coach, "but let him finish. I want to see how far he goes." Brett turned on David, his face twisted in anger. "You talking back again?" He unclipped a bottle of water from his belt. For a second, it looked like he might offer David a drink. Instead, Brett opened the cap and poured the water slowly over David's head. The shock of the water was brief, followed by the sticky humidity. "Cool off, tough guy," Brett laughed. From the crowd that had gathered, a few nervous giggles erupted, mostly from teenagers who didn't know better. But most of the townspeople looked horrified. They looked at Brett with fear, not respect. And that was the problem with the Oakhaven PD. They ruled by fear. David closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. He mentally catalogued every violation. Unlawful detainment. Excessive force. Falsifying a police report, verbally to the public. Conduct unbecoming. Assault. When he opened his eyes, they were cold. Hard. "Officer Kowalski," David said softly. The crowd went silent to hear him. "You have exactly 5 minutes to cut these ties and apologize. If you do, you might keep your pension. If you don't, you're going to lose a lot more than your job." Brett stared at him, stunned by the audacity. Then he threw his head back and laughed, a cruel, barking laugh. "My pension. Did you hear that, Chad? The hobo is threatening my pension. Who do you think you are? The mayor?" "No," David said. "I'm the guy who cleans up the mess." "Well, Mr. Cleaner," Brett sneered, leaning in close, his nose inches from David's. "You're going to stand here until you rot. I'm going to go inside, get a burger, and watch you sweat through the window. And if you say one more word, I'll gag you." Brett turned and swaggered toward the diner door. Chad looked at David, a flicker of apology in his eyes, but he turned and followed his partner like a loyal puppy. David was left alone, tied to the pole, as the town of Oakhaven watched in silence. But David wasn't just waiting. He was counting. And he knew something Brett didn't. He knew that Mayor Thompson was scheduled to meet the new chief of police at the station at 1:00 p.m. for a press conference. It was currently 12:45 p.m., and the mayor's car was just turning the corner onto Main Street. The town clock struck 1. The deep, resonating bong vibrated through the wooden utility pole, sending fresh waves of pain through David Sterling's shoulders. His hands were numb now, the circulation cut off so effectively by the industrial zip ties that his fingers had turned a sickly shade of waxen blue. The heat was relentless, a physical weight pressing down on the square. But David didn't slump. He stood perfectly straight, his military discipline overriding the screaming agony in his joints. A sleek, silver Lincoln Town car turned slowly onto Main Street. It was the kind of car that demanded space, gleaming immaculately amidst the dusty pickup trucks and sedans of Oakhaven. The Illinois state flag fluttered from a small mount on the fender. The crowd, which had grown to about 30 people, parted like water. They knew who was in that car. It was Mayor Robert Thompson. Thompson was a man of optics. He liked clean streets, balanced budgets, and good press. He was currently on his phone in the back seat, reviewing the talking points for the press conference scheduled in 10 minutes. "Is the chief at the station yet?" Thompson asked his aide, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah. "Dispatch says no," Sarah replied, frowning at her tablet. "They haven't seen him. His flight landed 4 hours ago. He rented a car, but he hasn't checked in." "Great," Thompson sighed, rubbing his temples. "I hire a war hero to clean up this department, and he's late on day one, just what I need." The car slowed to a crawl as the driver navigated around the people gathered on the sidewalk. "What is going on here?" Thompson muttered, looking out the tinted window. "Why is everyone staring at Patty's diner?" Then he saw it. At first, his brain refused to process the image. It looked like a prank, or perhaps a mannequin dressed in rags as part of the summer fair decorations. But then the mannequin moved its head. "Stop the car," Thompson ordered, his voice dropping an octave. "Sir, we're running late." "I said stop the damn car!" The Lincoln jerked to a halt. Thompson threw the door open and stepped out into the sweltering heat. He adjusted his tie instinctively, but his eyes were locked on the figure tied to the pole. He squinted against the glare. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dusty clothes, but it was the face that stopped Thompson's heart. He had spent 3 months staring at that face in personnel files. He had fought the city council for weeks to approve the hiring of this specific man. He knew the jawline, the scar above the left eyebrow, the intense, calculating gaze. "Oh my God," Thompson whispered. He broke into a run, something the mayor hadn't done in a decade. "Get back! Everyone get back!" he shouted at the crowd, waving his arms frantically. Mr. Henderson, the football coach who had tried to intervene earlier, stepped forward. "Mayor, your boys did this. Kowalski. He's got him tied up like a dog." Thompson didn't answer. He reached the pole and looked into David's eyes. He expected to see fear, or perhaps the glazed look of heat stroke. Instead, he saw a calm, terrifying rage. It was a controlled burn, like a fire trapped behind a steel door. "Chief Sterling?" Thompson asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Mayor," David replied. His voice was raspy from dehydration, but steady. "I assume the press conference is cancelled." I... Thompson stammered. He turned to his aide, who had followed him. "Sarah, get a knife. Get scissors. Now." Sarah scrambled toward the diner. "Who did this to you?" Thompson demanded, his face flushing red with a mix of embarrassment and fury. "Who tied the chief of police to a pole?" "One of your officers," David said dryly. Name tag said Kowalski. His partner, Higgins, took photos. They're inside eating lunch right now. Thompson looked at the diner window. He could see the back of Brett Kowalski's head. The officer was laughing, gesturing with a French fry. "I'm going to kill him," Thompson muttered. "I'm going to fire him, and then I'm going to kill him." "No," David said. The command was sharp enough to cut through the mayor's panic. "You're going to do exactly what I tell you to do." Sarah ran back out of the diner, followed by a confused waitress holding a pair of heavy-duty kitchen shears. The waitress, a young woman named Clara, looked at the mayor, then at the man on the pole, and gasped. "Cut him down," Thompson barked. Clara's hands shook as she jammed the shears behind the zip ties. The plastic was thick. It took 2 hands and a grunt of effort to snap them. Snap! David's arms fell to his sides. He didn't cry out, though the rush of blood back into his starved limbs must have felt like liquid fire. He swayed slightly, his knees buckling for a fraction of a second before he locked them. Mr. Henderson rushed forward to catch him, but David held up a hand. "I'm fine," David said. He rotated his wrists, grimacing as the feeling returned in painful prickles. He looked at the deep, red grooves the plastic had left in his skin. They were bleeding slightly. "We need an ambulance," Sarah said, reaching for her phone. "No ambulance," David said. He brushed the dust off his t-shirt. He looked at the mayor. "Do you have my badge, Robert?" It was the first time he had used the mayor's first name. It wasn't a request. It was a shift in hierarchy. Out here on the street, David Sterling was now in command. Yes. I have the presentation box in the car," Thompson said. "Get it," David said, "and get my sidearm if you have the permit processed. It's all in the trunk. We were going to do a ceremony." "The ceremony is happening now," David said, his eyes fixed on the diner door. "Get the badge, get the gun, and tell the crowd to take out their phones. I want everyone to record what happens next." The mayor nodded, sweat dripping down his face. He ran back to the car. The crowd sensed the shift. The atmosphere went from confused to electric. They pulled out smartphones. Mr. Henderson crossed his arms and smiled, a dark, satisfied smile. "Go get him, Chief," he whispered. Inside Patty's diner, the air conditioning was humming, drowning out the noise from the street. The smell of frying bacon and coffee filled the air. Brett Kowalski wiped ketchup from his lip and leaned back in the booth, feeling like a king. "Did you see his face?" Brett chuckled, picking his teeth with a fingernail. Looked like he was going to cry. "I have business at the station. Yeah, right. Business cleaning the toilets, maybe." Chad Higgins sat opposite him, picking at his coleslaw. He looked pale. He had checked the group chat. No one had laughed at the photo. In fact, Sergeant Miller had replied with a simple, "Who is that? Why is he in cuffs?" "Brett, maybe we should go check on him," Chad said nervously. "It's been 20 minutes. It's 90 degrees out there." "Relax, rookie," Brett scoffed. "Let him bake. It softens them up. By the time we drag him to the drunk tank, he'll be thanking us for a glass of tap water." The bell above the diner door jingled. Usually, when the door opened, there was the sound of chatter, the bustle of the street. But this time, silence rolled in like a fog. The ambient noise of the diner, the clinking of silverware, the murmur of conversation, died instantly. Brett frowned. He turned in his booth to see who had walked in. Standing in the doorway was the drifter. But he didn't look like a drifter anymore. David Sterling stood framed by the sunlight streaming in from behind him. He was covered in dust. His wrists were raw and bloody. His t-shirt was stained with sweat, but he stood with a posture that made him look 7 feet tall. Behind him stood Mayor Thompson, holding a polished walnut box and a holstered Glock 17. Behind the mayor, the doorway was crowded with the faces of the townspeople, phones raised, recording everything. Brett blinked. He slowly put his burger down. "How the hell did you get loose?" Brett demanded, standing up. He reached for his belt, his hand hovering over his baton. "I told you to stay on that pole, boy. Now you've got resisting arrest, escaping custody, and assaulting an officer on your tab." David didn't yell. He didn't scream. He walked forward, his boots heavy on the checkered linoleum floor. Step by methodical step. He stopped 5 feet from Brett's table. "Sit down, officer," David said. The voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the room. "Excuse me?" Brett laughed, though the laugh was thin. He looked at the mayor. Mayor Thompson, you seeing this? This vagrant broke free. I need you to step back so I can subdue him." Mayor Thompson didn't step back. He stepped forward, standing right beside David. He opened the walnut box. Inside, gleaming in the diner lights, was a gold shield. Not a patrolman's silver badge, a gold chief's shield. "Officer Kowalski," the mayor said, his voice dripping with venom. "You are not subduing anyone. You are speaking to Chief David Sterling, the new head of the Oakhaven Police Department." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating. Brett's face went through a complex series of contortions, confusion, denial. And then, a dawn of absolute, bowel-loosening terror. He looked at the badge in the box. He looked at the man he had zip-tied to a pole. He looked at the vagrant he had poured water on. That's not possible," Brett stammered. He looks like a bum. He has no car. I was walking," David said, interrupting him. "I wanted to see my town. I wanted to see my officers." David took a step closer, invading Brett's space, just as Brett had done to him on the road. "And I saw them. I saw everything I needed to see." Chad Higgins scrambled out of the booth, knocking over his iced tea. He practically threw himself against the wall, hands raised. "Chief, sir, I told him we shouldn't do it. I just took the picture because he told me to." David didn't look at Chad. His eyes were bored into Brett. "You like zip ties, Kowalski?" David asked softly. Brett couldn't speak. His mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock. "I asked you a question," David roared, the sudden volume making everyone in the diner jump. "Do you like zip ties?" "No, sir, Brett whispered, his hands shaking. "Give me your badge," David commanded. He held out his hand, his bloody, bruised hand. "Chief, I can explain. Badge. Gun. Now." Brett fumbled with his shirt. He unpinned the silver shield. His fingers were trembling so badly he dropped it. It clattered on the floor, spinning near David's boots. Brett reached for his gun belt, unbuckling it with the clumsiness of a child. He placed it on the table. "You are suspended immediately, pending an internal affairs investigation, which I will be conducting personally," David said. "You have no authority. You have no rank. You are a civilian." David picked up the gold badge from the mayor's box. He didn't pin it to his shirt. He held it up so the entire room could see it. Then he looked at Chad Higgins. "Officer Higgins," David said. Yes, sir," Chad squeaked. "Do you have cuffs?" "Yes, sir." "Arrest this man." David pointed at Brett. "What?" Brett gasped. "You can't arrest me." "For what?" David began to list the charges, ticking them off on his injured fingers. Unlawful imprisonment, assault under color of authority, kidnapping, torture, civil rights violations. And since you poured water on me and destroyed the appointment letter in my pocket, destruction of government property. David leaned in, his face inches from Brett's pale, sweating visage. "And loitering," David whispered. "You're loitering in my town." "Higgins!" David barked. "Cuff him!" Chad didn't hesitate this time. He grabbed his partner, his bully, by the shoulder, spun him around, and slammed him against the diner booth. Brett didn't fight back. He was in shock. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the world. "Read him his rights," David said, turning away. "And Higgins?" "Sir?" "Don't put him in the car," David said, his voice cold as ice. "Walk him to the station, right down the middle of Main Street." As Chad marched a weeping Brett Kowalski out of the diner, the patrons erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was a release of years of tension. People were cheering. Mr. Henderson was clapping so hard his hands hurt. David stood there, the adrenaline finally fading, leaving behind the throbbing pain in his wrists. The mayor put a hand on his shoulder. "I am so sorry, David," Thompson said. "I had no idea it was this bad." David looked at the door where his former tormentor was being paraded past the very pole he had used as a torture device. "It's over now, Mr. Mayor," David said. "Now, the work begins." But it wasn't over. Not for Brett Kowalski, and certainly not for the corrupt rot that had infested the department. David Sterling was just getting started. The Oak Haven police station was a fortress of brick and silence when Chief David Sterling finally walked through the double-glass doors at 2:30 p.m. He hadn't gone to the hospital. He hadn't gone to a hotel to shower. He walked in still wearing the dusty, sweat-stained grey t-shirt, his wrists wrapped in white gauze that Mayor Thompson's aide had retrieved from a first aid kit. The air in the station was stale, smelling of floor wax and old paper. The desk sergeant, an older man named Barney with a thick mustache and eyes that had seen too much and done too little, looked up from his crossword puzzle. He didn't recognize David. He just saw a disheveled black man walking with a limp. "Help you?" Barney grunted, not bothering to put down his pen. David walked up to the high desk. He placed his hands flat on the counter. "I'm looking for the watch commander." "Lieutenant Graves is in his office," Barney said, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. "And he's busy. If you want to file a complaint, take a form from the rack. We'll read it. Eventually." "I'm not filing a complaint," David said. He pulled the gold badge from his pocket and set it gently on the counter. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet lobby. "I'm filing a termination notice." Barney stared at the badge. Chief of Police. He looked up at David, his face draining of color. He scrambled to his feet, knocking his chair over. "Chief, we didn't know. The flight. We thought—" "Hit the alarm," David said calmly. "Sir, the muster alarm. Call every officer on duty and off duty to the bullpen. Immediately." 10 minutes later, the bullpen was full. 20 officers stood in loose rows. They were whispering, confusing looks darting between them. Rumors had already flown from the diner. Brett was in a cell. Chad was crying in the break room, and the new chief was here. David stood at the podium at the front of the room. He looked at them. He saw fear in some eyes, arrogance in others, and shame in a few. Lieutenant Graves, a man with a belly that strained his buttons and a face like a bulldog, stepped forward. He was Brett Kowalski's uncle, a fact David had memorized from the personnel files weeks ago. "Now look here," Graves started, his voice booming. "I don't know who you think you're coming in here looking like a homeless person, but you can't just arrest one of my best men. Brett Kowalski is a decorated officer. This is a misunderstanding. I'm authorizing his release immediately." David didn't blink. "Officer Kowalski is currently being processed by the state police, whom I called 10 minutes ago. He is out of your jurisdiction, Lieutenant." "State police." Graves turned purple. "You brought staties into my house?" "It's not your house anymore," David said. He picked up a folder he had brought with him. Not a physical folder, but a mental one. He pointed to a young female officer in the back row. "Officer Miller, step forward." The room went silent. Sergeant Sarah Miller, the one who had questioned the photo in the group chat, walked forward. She was shaking slightly. "You sent a message to the group chat at 12:50 p.m., David said, asking why a suspect was tied to a pole. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Miller whispered. "Did you receive a reply?" "Lieutenant Graves told me to. Mind my own business or I'd be on night shift for a year," she said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. A collective gasp went through the room. Graves looked like he was about to strike her. "Liar!" Graves shouted. "She's a rat. She is a police officer, David corrected. And as of this moment, she is the acting lieutenant. You can't do that, Graves roared. Lieutenant Graves, David said, his voice dropping to that dangerous, quiet register. I have reviewed the dashcam footage from Officer Kowalski's cruiser. The audio was running the entire time. You called him while I was tied to that pole. I heard your voice on the speakerphone. You laughed. You told him to leave him there until he melts. The room was deadly silent. That is conspiracy to commit torture, David said. Officer Miller, take Lieutenant Graves's badge and gun. Miller hesitated only a second. She stepped up to the lieutenant, her face set in stone. Badge and gun, Lieutenant. Graves looked around the room for support. The blue wall he had relied on for 20 years was crumbling. The other officers looked at their shoes. They looked at the floor. No one moved to help him. They saw the fire in David Sterling's eyes, and they knew the old kingdom was dead. Graves threw his badge on the floor and stormed out, followed by 2 state troopers who were waiting in the hallway to escort him off the premises. David turned back to the room. I'm going to make this very clear, David said. I don't care who your father was. I don't care who you know on the city council. If you abuse the public, you are done. If you turn off your body camera, you are done. If you treat this badge like a crown instead of a shield, you are done. He walked down the line of officers, looking each one in the eye. Tonight, we are going to audit the evidence locker. Tomorrow, we are going to review every arrest report filed by Brett Kowalski in the last 5 years. If I find one discrepancy, one lie, one missing dollar, there will be more empty desks. He stopped in front of Chad Higgins, who had been brought into the lineup, eyes red and puffy. Higgins, David said. Sir, Higgins sniffled. You followed an illegal order, but you also booked your partner when I told you to. You're on desk duty until further notice. You will testify against Kowalski. If you lie to protect him, you will share his cell. Do you understand? Yes, sir. I'll tell the truth. I swear. David walked back to the podium. He leaned heavily on it. The adrenaline was fading, and the pain in his arms was blinding. But he couldn't show weakness. Not yet. Dismissed. Get to work. As the officers scrambled to their duties, trying to look busy and efficient, David walked into the chief's office. He closed the blinds. He sat in the leather chair that smelled of Lieutenant Graves' cheap cologne. He looked at his wrists. The blood had dried into dark crusts. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. Mayor Thompson? David, how is it going over there? The press is going crazy. Let them, David said. I need a prosecutor, a shark, someone who isn't afraid of the police union. Because I'm not just going to fire Kowalski. I'm going to make an example of him that this state will never forget. 3 months later, the heat of July had faded into a crisp brown October. The Oakhaven County Courthouse was a grand limestone building that usually hosted traffic appeals and petty theft trials. Today, it was the center of the national media universe. Satellite trucks lined the streets. Protesters stood on the lawn, some supporting the police, but the vast majority holding signs that read, "Justice for the Chief" and "No more badges for bullies." Inside courtroom 4B, the air was thick with tension. Judge Harlan Thorne sat on the bench. He was a man known for his severity, a strict constitutionalist who had no patience for theatrics. Brett Kowalski sat at the defense table. He looked different. The swagger was gone. He had lost 20 pounds. His buzz cut had grown out into a patchy, unkempt mess. He wore a cheap suit that didn't fit, a stark contrast to the uniform he used to wear like armor. His attorney was Silas Vane, a high-priced lawyer flown in by the police union. Vane was slick, with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He had made a career out of getting dirty cops off the hook by blaming the victims. The prosecutor, Linda Greer, stood to make her opening statement. She was small, sharp, and terrifyingly competent. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Greer began, walking slowly in front of the jury box. "This case is not complicated. It is not about split-second decisions or the fog of war. It is about cruelty. It is about a man who believed his badge gave him the right to treat a human being like an animal." She pointed at Brett. "Officer Kowalski tied a man to a pole for 45 minutes in 90-degree heat. He mocked him. He took photos of him. He did it for fun. The defense will tell you he felt threatened. They will tell you he followed protocol, but the evidence will show you the truth." Silas Vane stood up for the defense. He adjusted his silk tie. "The truth?" Vane chuckled darkly. "The truth is that my client, Officer Kowalski, encountered a suspicious individual, a drifter, no ID, refusing to comply. My client used non-lethal restraint to secure the scene. He didn't know this man was the chief of police, and that is the point. If it had been a real drifter, would we be here? No. This is a political witch hunt, because the victim happens to have a high rank." It was a dirty tactic. Vane was trying to appeal to the jury's bias, suggesting that policing was ugly business, and David should have just identified himself better. The trial dragged on for 3 days. Chad Higgins took the stand. Under Vane's cross-examination, he stuttered and cried, admitting he was scared of Brett, but Vane twisted it to make it look like Chad was incompetent and Brett was just taking charge. Then came the climax. The prosecution called their final witness. "The state calls Chief David Sterling." David walked to the stand. He wore his dress uniform, navy blue, gold buttons, the gold shield gleaming on his chest. He didn't limp. He moved with the precision of the tactical commander he was. He sat down and placed his hands on his lap. The jury leaned in. Vane began his cross-examination aggressively. "Chief Sterling," Vane said, pacing, "why didn't you just tell Officer Kowalski who you were? Why play games? Why provoke him?" "I told him my ID was in my pocket," David said calmly. He chose not to look. "I told him I had business at the station. He chose to laugh." "But you didn't say, 'I am the chief,'" Vane pressed. "You wanted to test him, didn't you? You entrapped him. A police officer's character is not defined by how he treats his superiors, Mr. Vane," David replied, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom. "It is defined by how he treats the powerless. If I had told him I was the chief, he would have treated me with respect. But I needed to know how he treated a man with no power. And I found out." "You found out?" Vane sneered. "And so you decided to destroy his life over a misunderstanding." "It wasn't a misunderstanding," David said. "It was a crime." "Do you have proof of malice?" Vane challenged. "Real proof? Because all we have is a photo, and some he said, she said." David looked at Prosecutor Greer. She nodded. "Actually," David said, "we have the cloud." Vane froze. "Objection." "What?" "Your client took a photo with his personal cell phone," David explained, turning to the jury. "He then sent it to a group chat. But he also had his phone set to auto-backup videos to a shared family cloud account, an account his ex-wife has access to." Brett's head snapped up. His face went white. "Officer Kowalski recorded a video before the photo," David continued. "He thought he deleted it from his gallery, but he didn't delete it from the cloud. We subpoenaed it yesterday." Judge Thorne looked over his glasses. "Ms. Greer, do you have this video?" "We do, Your Honor. Permission to play Exhibit G." "Play it." The large screens in the courtroom flickered to life. The video was shaky, vertical footage. It showed David tied to the pole. But it was the audio that destroyed Brett Kowalski. On the video, Brett's voice was clear. "Look at this monkey," the digital Brett sneered. "I bet he screams if I tighten it. Hey Chad, how long do you think he lasts before he passes out? Let's leave him here until shift change. I want to see him beg." The courtroom gasped. The racial slur hung in the air like toxic smoke. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't procedure. It was hate. Pure, distilled hate. Brett Kowalski put his head in his hands. Vane, the slick lawyer, stopped pacing. He slowly sat down and closed his file. He knew it was over. There was no spinning this. David stared at Brett from the witness stand. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just watched the justice system work. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. "We find the defendant, Brett Kowalski, guilty on all counts," the foreman read. "Kidnapping, aggravated assault, civil rights violations, and official misconduct." Judge Thorne looked at Brett. "Mr. Kowalski," the judge said, his voice like grinding stones, "you disgraced your uniform, you betrayed the public trust, and you showed a level of depravity that has no place in civilized society. Sentencing is set for next week," Thorne continued, "but I will tell you now. You are going to prison, and given that you are a former police officer convicted of a hate crime, you will likely be placed in protective custody. Solitary confinement. 23 hours a day in a small room." The judge paused, leaning forward. "It seems, Mr. Kowalski, that you are going to experience exactly what you inflicted on Chief Sterling. You will be tied to one spot with no one to help you for a very, very long time. Bail is revoked. Remand to custody." The bailiff moved in. He pulled Brett's hands behind his back. The metallic click-click of the handcuffs echoed the sound from the diner months ago. Brett looked back at the gallery as he was led away. He looked for his uncle, Lieutenant Graves. But Graves wasn't there. He looked for Chad. Chad was looking at the floor. Finally, Brett locked eyes with David Sterling. David didn't look away. He gave a single, slow nod. Karma. The gavel banged, signaling the end of Brett Kowalski's life as a free man and the beginning of a new era for Oak Haven. 1 year later. The summer sun was back in Oak Haven, but the air felt different. It was cleaner, lighter. The oppressive weight of fear that had hung over the town like humidity had lifted, replaced by something fragile but growing. Trust. Chief David Sterling stood on the sidewalk of Main Street, exactly where he had been tied to the pole 12 months ago. The wooden utility pole was still there, but it looked different now. Someone, David didn't know who, had tied a blue ribbon around it. It wasn't a symbol of police support, but a memorial to the event that had woken the town up. David adjusted his uniform. He wasn't wearing the tactical gear he favored in the early days of the Purge, as the town called his first month. He was in his dress blues. Today was the annual summer fair, the same event that was being prepared the day he arrived. "Chief!" a voice called out. David turned to see Sarah Miller walking toward him. She wasn't a sergeant anymore. She wore the silver bars of a lieutenant on her collar. She walked with confidence, her head held high, waving at shop owners who waved back with genuine smiles. "Morning, Lieutenant," David smiled. "Everything secure for the parade?" "Yes, sir. Roadblocks are up. We have the foot patrol volunteers checking in now." She paused, looking at the pole. "Hard to believe it's been a year." "A lot can happen in a year," David said quietly. And a lot had. Brett Kowalski was currently serving the first year of a 15-year sentence at State Penitentiary. Reports said he spent 23 hours a day in a cell, reading letters from the very people he had tormented. His uncle Graves had lost his pension and moved 2 states over, working night security at a mall. But the real change wasn't the punishment of the wicked, it was the redemption of the weak. Chad Higgins walked up to them. He looked older, more mature. He wasn't cowering anymore. After 6 months of desk duty and rigorous retraining, David had given him a second chance. Chad had taken it with both hands. He was now the department's community liaison officer. He spent his days in schools, not bullying kids, but coaching basketball and teaching safety courses. "Chief," Chad said, offering a hand, "Mr. Henderson wants to know if you're ready for the speech." "As ready as I'll ever be," David said. They walked together toward the town square stage. As they passed Patty's diner, David saw a group of teenagers sitting in the booth where Brett used to hold court. They were laughing, eating fries. When they saw David, they didn't look down or hide. One of them, a kid with a skateboard, gave him a nod. "Afternoon, Chief," the kid said. "Afternoon, son," David replied. It was a small thing, but to David, it was everything. He stepped up onto the wooden stage. The crowd was massive, hundreds of people. Mayor Thompson was there, clapping enthusiastically. The cameras were there too, but this time they weren't recording a crime. They were recording a community. David approached the microphone. The feedback squealed for a second, then settled. He looked out at the sea of faces. He saw black, white, Hispanic faces. He saw rich and poor. He saw the waitress, Clara, who had cut him down. 12 months ago, David began, his voice echoing off the brick buildings. "I came to this town looking for a job. Instead, I found a mirror." The crowd went silent. "I found a mirror that showed us exactly who we were," David continued. "We were a town that had let fear make us quiet. We were a department that let power make us cruel. And I was a man who thought he could fix it all alone." He looked at Sarah Miller and Chad Higgins standing by the stage stairs. "I was wrong. I didn't fix Oakhaven. You did." He pointed to Clara. "You cut the ties." He pointed to Mr. Henderson. "You spoke up when it was dangerous." He pointed to the crowd. "You recorded the truth." "Justice isn't a gavel hitting a desk," David said, his voice rising with emotion. "And it isn't a badge on a chest. Justice is what happens when we decide that nobody, not a chief, not a mayor, and certainly not a bully, is above the dignity of a human being." He took a deep breath. "My name is David Sterling. I am your chief of police, and I promise you this. As long as I hold this shield, no one in this town will ever be invisible again." The applause didn't start as a roar. It started as a ripple. Mr. Henderson clapped first, then Clara, then the teenagers. And then it was a thunderclap that shook the birds from the clock tower. David stepped back, his eyes wet. He looked at the utility pole one last time. It was just a piece of wood now. The shadow it cast was gone, swallowed by the bright, midday sun. He walked down the stairs, not as a conqueror, but as a neighbor. The nightmare was over. The work was done. And for the first time in 20 years, David Sterling didn't feel like a soldier. He felt like he was home. The story of David Sterling serves as a brutal, yet beautiful reminder that authority without humanity is nothing but tyranny. It shows us that titles and uniforms do not make a man. Character does. Brett Kowalski believed that power gave him the right to crush others, but he forgot the most fundamental law of the universe. What you put out into the world will eventually return to you, often with 10 times the force. David's victory wasn't just in seeing his tormentor put behind bars. It was in dismantling the culture of silence that allowed men like Kowalski to exist. It reminds us that being a good person isn't just about not doing evil. It's about having the courage to cut the zip ties when we see them. In the end, Oakhaven didn't just get a new chief, they got their soul back. That brings us to the end of this roller coaster of justice, betrayal, and redemption. It's a powerful lesson on why you should never judge a book by its cover, and why you should definitely never tie a stranger to a pole. I want to hear from you in the comments. If you were in the diner that day, would you have stood up to Officer Kowalski? Or would you have been too afraid to speak? Be honest. It's a tough situation. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more dramas where karma hits hard and justice is served, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a good twist, and subscribe with notifications on so you never miss the next story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.